So quick disclaimer, this is based off of my personal experience, not so much a game critique, so, feel free to disagree with me all you want in the comment section. And I wanted a reason to revisit 2016 ultimately, and this was my excuse. So with that being said, enjoy. The year 2020 was a weird one to say the least. The world essentially shut down due to a global pandemic, and in some countries, being stuck inside and talking to yourself while binge watching tons of porn finally became socially acceptable. While for other countries, going around and licking toilet seats and doorknobs to see whose parents are really biological siblings became a challenge. Gotta keep the bloodline pure, I guess. Thankfully, for the world, we had Doometernal to keep us busy. Now whenever Doometernal is brought up, typically you get one of two views. One that oozes with praise for its software yet again, knocking this masterpiece out of the park, blowing expectations out of the water, and somehow showing the entire industry what a proper game sequel is. It's one that innovates in ways that properly pays homage to, in Doom's case, its deep cultural roots and contributions to the entire gaming industry, while doubling down on what makes it great without making anything feel boringly repetitive or pushing the new mechanics or features so far that it alienates the established player base. Doom 2016 was itself for finding the Holy Grail, while Doom Eternal's them putting that Holy Grail into a giant furnace, melting and shaping it into a giant fucking sword, and attaching it to the Doomslayer's arm, and letting him rip and tear everything across an entire universe. It's glorious. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. I did mention that there was another point of contention after all.
The thing that really pushed me over the edge, though, were...
Welcome to Doom Eternal.
The uh-oh curve. What is the uh-oh curve?
Then you're basically on shitty fan...
Yeah, none of those guys have a say. I try to give them a fair point, but it speaks for itself. Before we move on to Eternal, let's first discuss Doom 2016, since it's the game that brought back the arena shooter, and there's not any other games really similar to Eternal, or Doom, abroad. It's been said that these two games technically, although in the same world, and Eternal is a sequel to 2016, they do technically cater to different player bases, whereas in Eternal you have to work for that power fantasy. With 2016 it's kind of given to you. But I digress. And I made it a point in the past that I wasn't a big fan of Doom 2016. Yeah, I know how that sounds, a little blasphemous, but hear me out. It was a great game. I'm not saying it was bad in any way. It just didn't captivate me in the same way that it captivated other people, where they were able to sink hundreds of hours into the single player campaign. The push forward combat and rewarding aggression over hiding for your health to regenerate. The mechanic of glory kills and the concept of getting your health back by ripping your very adversaries apart with your bare hands. The music and environments you explored, the entire experience, that overall package that Doom 2016 had to offer was an incredible one. Although for me personally, it was a very limited game when it came to replayability. From my experience, the game's mechanics were as vast as an ocean but as deep as a puddle. I experimented with micro missiles or the plasma rifle stun bomb when I can just eliminate everything with the Gauss cannon and super shotgun, and kill it all even faster. That power fantasy that id Software really wanted to deliver on, they did it so brilliantly that it was almost a detriment to the gameplay. In a positive way, of course, because that's what they were going for. You either cheese fights or you plow through with a few select weapons because fuck it works, and the game never actively pushes you out of that comfort zone. You're not corralled to play a certain way. I pretty much played the game the exact same way, experimenting a little bit in my movement rather than my weapon combinations, and honestly by the time I was even slightly encouraged to experiment with the weapon combinations, I already seen and did it all that the incentive to do that really wasn't there. In a previous video I talked about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. To redefine those two things, intrinsic motivation is essentially player creativity. You do it because you got a hard on for it, or you thought it was cool or interesting, you wanted to be flashy. Basically, you perform that action because you wanted to do it, you thought it was fun or cool. There's no real incentive beyond that. Extrinsic motivation is the game's reward that it provides you with for performing that a certain action. Extrinsic motivation can be good or bad. For instance, in Doom 2016, the motivating factor to not miss a platforming section is because you're automatically just gonna die. That's obviously something negative, so that's your motivating factor to not miss. Now these two things are very important in game design. Regardless of whatever genre we're talking about or what type of game it is, it doesn't matter. For extrinsic motivation, you want the players to be pushed to experiment with the game's features, with the game's mechanics. Now there's a very fine line here. In any game that encourages different playstyles, you want the player to realize that said combinations could make things easier for them. But you also don't want to be too heavy-handed, otherwise it'll alienate a certain portion of the audience experience and create a skill ceiling of sorts. So you need to find that right balance between the two. In Doom 2016, they did a fairly good job of it, allowing players to experiment with different weapons and find cool and flashier ways to kill the demons. However, Doom Eternal took this and expanded on it tenfold, and for the most part, they did amazing work. Minus these two. Fuck these guys. These guys are nothing but gimmicks. And I stand by that. I also believe this action that the developers are requiring you to perform should be satisfying in one way or another. Again, using the concept of glory kills as an example here, if they were just a tad bit too slow or incredibly boring and samey, then that would just become a chore, and players would just find themselves going through the motion having to perform this very action because, well, their health depends on it. But the lack of enjoyment would break the experience from the glory kills being too slow in a game that promotes actively moving and strafing as fast as possible. And with an action that's done as frequently as glory kills, it'll just kill players' excitement to progress any forward if they're not enjoying that specific action. There's plenty of motivating factors to do that, and luckily the intrinsic motivators are all present and visually stimulating, like an acid trip through the sea of stars. Unfortunately though, there's no real support system like that to corral you into experimenting with weapons beyond what works for you. Loosening the reins a little bit too much here, I think a lot of the love players found in 2016 was them taking it upon themselves to experiment with the weapons on their own, swapping from weapon to weapon as fast as possible, clearing out entire fights as quickly as they can, learning the confines of 2016 and all of its mechanics and features, and they want to push those systems as far as they can possibly go to see what exactly the game and even their own limitations are within the confines of that game. A lot of people fell in love with Doom 2016 because they decided to stick around and experiment a little bit with their own personal power fantasy of ripping and tearing and using whatever weapons served their unique idea of what that power fantasy is. Player creativity and the motivating factors within 2016 are all present. The game providing a real tangible reason for you to experiment with other weapon combinations aren't really in 2016's gameplay loop. The tools are there, by all means, yes, but the game doesn't encourage you to experiment and get out of that comfort zone, which makes 2016 a game that ultimately makes one feel like something is missing. You have all these amazing ways to kill the very armies of hell, yet you find yourself playing in a routine that fits your playstyle because it's the most comfortable for you, and in turn it makes the game feel incredibly repetitive and samey. Luckily, that offset of player creativity and that power fantasy is so strong that hardcore players and the ones that were still around once that initial honeymoon phase of ripping and tearing wore off were able to stick around and find some depth to the game that a casual like me wasn't able to do. But ultimately, 2016 was still a breath of fresh air from other shooters. It didn't have the same depth to keep me longer than a few playthroughs like it did with so many others, but I still enjoyed my time. And luckily, that's a problem that Doom Eternal solved. I actually bought Doom Eternal expecting to be done with this game a few playthroughs in, the same way I was with 2016. I didn't expect longevity out of this game, and even expected to be done with it long before the DLC. I actually didn't pay the DLC any mind. I thought it was just some tacked on incentive to support the devs. I guess the Fallout 76 fiasco was heavy on my mind as far as Bethesda branded stuff was concerned, but holy shit was I wrong. I think Eternal is something that every game can take from. Great sound design that's subtle yet loud enough to catch your attention. They're showing Call of Duty, a multiplayer based, I guess technically it still is a Twitch shooter, that not every minute sound in the game has to be an audible assault in your eardrums. Weapon balancing, player accountability, and probably most importantly of all, what the hell a proper game sequel should be. Remember I said earlier, Doom 2016 gives you that power fantasy while Eternal makes you work for it? 2016 makes you feel like a god. Eternal gives you the tools to become a god. Long gone are the days of running around an arena looking for some extra armor, health, or ammunition. All of that shit is at your fingertips. Player accountability is in full swing here, baby. If you die or run out of ammunition, that's completely 100% your fault and your fault alone. The chainsaw is reworked to always regenerate one fuel canister so you can always chainsaw a fodder or weaker demon, which every arena in the game has a plethora of, and you know there's a lot of them because if you backpedal for a decent amount of time, you will get stuck on one. Armor is tied to your shoulder-mounted flamethrower known as your flame belch. Glory kills are tied to health, and if you ever get cornered, there's a sequence of movements you can utilize at any time to break free. Eternal's 2016 streamlined movement is faster, I guess, I don't know, maybe. I remember hearing talks that the base movement is actually slower than 2016's, but who fucking cares? You have a double dash and most importantly, a goddamn meat hook. And to accommodate for those two things, arenas are automatically bigger and do incorporate even more verticality, so how you can say you move slower, is beyond me. But lastly, the extrinsic motivators are all present to use your entire weapon arsenal in the form of cut ammo reserves and, more importantly, the weak point system. Single-handedly, the function that makes you addicted to bells. So the long-winded way of answering this guy's question is, 2016 was a mindless shooter.